welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on WJOP-LP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I am so pleased to welcome back to the show Kurt Braddock, who is an assistant professor of public communication at American University. His research has focused on the persuasive strategies used by violent extremist groups to recruit and radicalize audiences targeted by their propaganda, and what strategies can be used to counter that. He's the author of the book Weaponized Words, The Strategic Role of Persuasion in Violent Radicalization and Counter-radicalization, which came out from Cambridge University Press in 2020. I was privileged to talk to Kurt last year about his work on the use of psychological inoculation, or countering extremism by educating people about the strategies that can be used to indoctrinate them. Analogous to a medical vaccine, you can thereby provide some immunity to the effects. His most recent research is on stochastic terror, which he's going to explain to us today. Kurt, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking time to visit the morning show.
Mary, my pleasure. It's good to see you again.
It's great to see you, absolutely. And I was so pleased to learn that that you're studying stochastic terror, because it was a relatively new phrase for me to come across. It's been in news and commentary more in the last few months, particularly as the follow-up to the violent assault on Paul Pelosi, as well as an unfortunate, really dismaying uptick in anti-Semitic rhetoric and violence and other acts of politically and racially motivated violence. Yet the term is one that many of us were not, I certainly wasn't familiar with. I didn't know there was a name for this type of terrorism. So let's start off, if you would, Kurt, just by defining stochastic. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the word as I was, I want to spell it for you. It's S-T-O-C-H-A-S-T-I-C. Could you tell us what stochastic means and how it's linked to terrorism?
Yeah, of course. So the term stochastic, and that's my dog saying hello, snoring in my lap.
I love a dog appearance.
So stochastic or stochasticism, it's a term out of statistics, and it essentially describes a process that's individually impossible to predict. So you can't figure out when and where it's going to happen, but this process will reliably happen. So if you imagine a stochastic process not related to terrorism, if you're sitting on your front porch, this is an example I often describe, and you see dark clouds rolling in, you can be sure that lightning will strike somewhere, but it's almost impossible to predict when and where it's going to happen. Or a better example that's often cited in the literature is if your biology class in high school was anything like mine, you take a petri dish and you would sneeze in the petri dish on purpose and then close it. And then a couple of days later, bacteria would grow. And you couldn't predict when and where it would grow, but it would grow. So a stochastic process is one where you can't predict when and where it'll occur, but it will occur. Now, when we apply that to terrorism, the idea is that when an individual who has a large enough audience, we're talking in the thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even in the millions, when they say certain things that allude to the use of violence without actually advocating or ordering violence, when they have an audience that big, even if every individual in that group that receives the message has a 0.0000001% chance of interpreting it as a call to violence, the larger the audience is, the closer we get to 100% certainty that at least one person will interpret it as a call to violence. And as of now, we don't have the ability to predict when and where that's going to happen. So that's stochastic terrorism, is when an individual with a large public platform makes statements that, although they don't direct the use of violence overtly, they allude to it and suggest it and joke about it to the point that an individual might interpret it as an actual call to violence and go forward in doing so.
So it's almost certain to happen, but what you can't predict, you can predict that it will happen, especially with the range and the size of the audience and the size of the platform that the speaker of the words that would incite someone to violence. But you don't know who it's going to be and exactly when it's going to happen, but it approaches a near certainty that it will eventually happen, like the thunderstorm. That's
right. A good way to think of it is, as I said, if everybody has a 0.00001% chance of not interpreting it as a call to violence, or as interpreting as a call to violence, that
Yeah.
means they have a 0.999 or 99.9999% chance of not interpreting as a call to
Yeah.
violence. And that sounds good. But when you multiply that times 1 million, you see that the
Yeah.
number approaches 100%, meaning that at least
Yeah.
one person will interpret it as a call to violence.
Yeah. I'm curious to find out then, Kurt, would you categorize the January 6th insurrection, the assault on the Capitol, would you categorize that as a stochastic violence at work?
I do. I do call that a stochastic terrorist incident, because there were statements made by several individuals, both on the day of the attack and the days leading up to the attack, that alluded to the use of violence. And the language being used as they got closer to January 6th grew stronger and stronger in terms of its allusions to the use of violence. So I do consider
Yeah.
January 6th to be a stochastic
Yeah.
terrorist.
Well, the danger of stochastic terror seems to have become a feature of our political landscape these days. With what you're describing about the January 6th insurrection and the big lie that it was based on, and there are still millions and millions of Americans who believe in and subscribe to that big lie. And we're in a political environment now where there are constant threats against election workers, members of Congress, even local school board members, and not just the officials themselves, but their families, even their children, receive, really the most revolting, violent kinds of threats. Would you categorize these types of anonymous threats, usually, would you categorize those as a form of stochastic terrorism as well, or as something else?
Well, they're very, very context bound. So you usually look at them on a case to case basis, because incidents of stochastic terrorism, like terrorism more generally, it's a relatively low base rate phenomenon. But unfortunately, it only takes one incident to do a lot of damage.
Yeah.
Now, that said, if we go back to our basic definitions for terrorism, terrorism isn't just an attack. It's also the threat of attack to achieve political goals. So if we use the classic definitions for what constitutes terrorism and combine it with these stochastic processes, then you could make an argument that these are incidents of stochastic terrorism if they're meant to achieve political goals, which in a lot of cases they do seem to be.
Well, they often seem to be meant to just terrify people out of wanting to be an election worker or wanting to run for office or serve on a school board. So it seems like it would jive with the definition of terrorism to that extent. And often the platforms that you were mentioning earlier, like the big lie itself, they often are, well, they foment, I guess that's a good verb, isn't it? It's often called misinformation or disinformation that make people feel either outraged or fearful about what's going to happen to them. And I myself, the words disinformation or misinformation sound like accidental falsehoods to me. And so I've coined a new phrase. I'll try it out on you, Kurt. We're familiar with the phrase motivated reasoning. I think that's come into the general lexicon, meaning we tend to believe and find reasons to believe what we want to believe. But I've coined the phrase motivated lying, since to me that's an accurate description often of what's being said and why it's being said. And I wonder if you're willing to bear with me and use my newly coined phrase, motivated lying.
Happy
What
to.
what types of motivated lies are most likely, when they're spread on a platform, to prompt stochastic terror or violence?
Often what we're seeing, at least in the last several years, the kinds of lies that seem to prompt the most aggressive responses, including the use of violence, are motivated lies that are easily kind of demonstrated to be false, but target individual kind of identities. So we're talking LGBTQ type people, we're talking immigrants, the kinds that kind of de-individuate and dehumanize large groups of individuals, that really foment this idea of us versus them. And that's kind of a classic motivation for people engaging in violence against others in the first place, that they perceive them as an outgroup who is a threat to their way of life. And we see that quite a bit in the last year. There's been quite a lot of talk surrounding immigration, LGBTQ communities, and other kinds of identities and identity-based groups who they're seen as a threat to the quote classic American way of life, and they've come under attack. We saw earlier last year, I think it was in May, there was quite a bit of discussion in the right-wing media space, both the mainstream and the non-mainstream spaces, where there were talks of the Great Replacement theory, which is an old theory that says that kind of traditional, quote, traditional white Americans are being replaced by non-white Americans and immigrants. And we saw a couple of incidents where people were attacked and killed, and the attacker actually cited Great Replacement theory. So the Great Replacement theory, for example, it's very easy to demonstrate that it is false. So it's not as though these individuals who spread these lies know that they're waterproof. They're not waterproof, but they use them anyway. And they often lead to violence, like we saw in places like Buffalo, which is one of the biggest kinds of what I call stochastic terror incidents that we've seen in some time.
Yeah, famously, there's so many of them. There's Christchurch in New Zealand. They just seem to be multiplying like the bacteria in the Petri dish, so to speak. And these, I like you gave an excellent description of the circumstances that can lead to stochastic terror, the near certainty that if you spread these dehumanizing, motivated lies about groups and make people feel fearful or outraged or indignant, or so their in-group is endangered, then you're almost certain to create the circumstances that will lead to violence. But then the people who have been spreading the motivated lies will not claim any responsibility for the violence that almost certainly will pursue. There's a very famous incidence of this. I mentioned to you when we were preparing for this interview, and it ages me a bit to say that I saw the film Beckett when it first came out because it dates from the late 60s, but I was in high school. But this is a famous historic example of stochastic terror. It's a movie about the relationship between Henry II, who's played by Peter O'Toole, and Archbishop Thomas Becket, played by Richard Burton. Have you seen the film, Kurt?
I've not seen the film, but I'm very, very familiar with the example. It's funny. I know that you were concerned as to whether it was a good example or not, but that quote that you mentioned, and I'm sure you're going to bring it up, will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest? That's actually, there's another stochastic terror researcher named Reed Malloy. He's a very, very good researcher who he uses that exact quote to open one of his articles on stochastic terror because it's a very, very good example.
Well, yeah, and the quote is that the famous scene from this film, and it haunted me. It stayed with me the first time I saw the phrase stochastic terror. That's actually the scene that came to my mind because Henry II is really angry at Thomas Becket because he's getting in the way of unsavory things that he wants to do. And what he says to his henchmen who are hanging around him is, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And lo and behold, in the film, as soon as he says that Becket is going to be assassinated, and he is assassinated by one of Henry II's henchmen. But then Henry II, at the time and historically, has been seen as not directly responsible or legally responsible for the assassination of Becket because he didn't direct them. It was an indirect cry to their loyalty. And so that gave him, we've all heard the phrase plausible deniability. And what I wanted to ask you, Kurt, was, is this deniability plausible in your view?
It is. It is one of the complicated and complex things about stochastic terror processes is that they are completely legal. Stochastic terrorism does not meet the threshold for legal incitement. And I'm going to sound as though I'm contradicting myself because I'm very critical of individuals who engage in this kind of rhetoric. But I think it's rightfully so that it's First Amendment protected. I'm a very staunch First Amendment advocate. And I believe unless it meets the threshold, the legal threshold as decided upon by the courts, which in the case of stochastic terror, typically people reference the Brandenburger versus Ohio decision, which kind of showed where the threshold for legal incitement is. Unless it meets that threshold, then it should be protected by law. But that does mean in a very frustrating way that individuals who espouse this and clearly have some influence on individuals who engage in this activity, they do have plausible deniability. They can make that case. Now, something that I think it's really important to remember, and this is something that I've had to face criticism from my research related to stochastic terrorism, typically from right-wing politicians, because they think I'm trying to tamp down on their freedom of speech, number one, and number two, that it doesn't meet legal incitement. And my argument is, just because something isn't legally prosecutable, just because something doesn't meet the legal threshold for something, doesn't mean that it doesn't have negative implications.
Yes.
So just because this doesn't meet the illegal threshold for incitement doesn't mean people aren't still killing each other because of this rhetoric.
Yeah.
So because of that, I think it's worthy of our attention and worthy of our efforts to try to stop, or at least to try to intervene in the processes that lead somebody to take certain kinds of language and engage in violence on behalf of it.
Yeah. I mean, it is such an interesting challenge. Certainly, we cherish the First Amendment. None of us want to lose our rights to free speech, because if we did, that could be used in so many negative ways. It's not hard to imagine. And yet this danger does exist, that when, let's call it, it may not be illegal, but it may be an abuse, if that word fits. I have to think about that, but we use it for
I think it
shorthand
fits.
now.
I think it fits. It's exploitation.
Yeah, if we're going to exploit those First Amendment rights, then we do create fertile terrain for people who are very susceptible to being manipulated into violence, who then serve often the political purposes, as in the case of Henry II, whose ends will be served by that, because it creates an atmosphere of terror and fear around, for example, running for school board or being an election worker. So it does create this kind of tension, Kurt. How do we approach this? What do we do? Now, I know that you have worked very hard and very persuasively on demonstrating through your research that there are ways to verbally inoculate people against propaganda that runs the danger of radicalizing people. Do you see a role for psychological inoculation in helping our culture deal with stochastic terrorism?
I do think that's a frontline defense against it, and something that when we talked about inoculation months ago, we talked primarily about inoculating against content. So if you want to protect somebody against anti-Semitism, for example, you would expose them to weakened versions of anti-Semitic arguments and then give them the ability to counter against it. But something we didn't talk about as much is that there's research to show that you can inoculate against a strategy too. So rather than say I'm inoculating somebody against anti-Semitic kinds of ideas, you can inoculate them against the kinds of strategies people use to spread that content. Stochastic terrorism is one form of strategic communication that I think can be inoculated against. So for those of you that hadn't heard the original interview, attitudinal inoculation or psychological inoculation, the way it works is, when you let an individual know that the beliefs and attitudes they have are at risk of changing, they're motivated to defend them. So when somebody's motivated to defend the beliefs and attitudes they have, they're more open to hearing counter arguments against what they're going to encounter. And research has shown that when you do that, they become resilient to the ideas you inoculate against. My research has shown that you can inoculate against far right and far left propaganda. There's 60 years of research to show you can inoculate against risky health behaviors, all sorts of things. It's pretty definitive evidence that inoculation works. What I argue is that we can develop inoculation campaigns or inoculation messages to tell people who might be vulnerable to the kinds of messages that jive with stochastic terrorism, that listen, we know you're not violent and you don't want to become violent. The problem is that individuals have been exposed to messages that you're going to be exposed to and have become violent on the back of it. That should motivate the person to defend against the idea of becoming violent. It has the added bonus too, inoculation against stochastic terrorism specifically, of saying, I don't want to affect your beliefs and attitudes. It's fine, you can believe whatever you want. I just don't want you to become violent on behalf of it. So somebody should be motivated to remain nonviolent. And then when they encounter the kinds of messages that might motivate violence, they're more likely to be resilient against it. So I think that's a very, very plausible, very, very promising area of research that I'm going into right now. along with research that's looking at kind of the psychological precedents that lead somebody to interpret something as a call to violence.
Well, that's fascinating, and I'm so glad you're doing that research, Kurt. And I was hoping perhaps you could expand a little bit upon some of the strategies then. I mean, we were talking before about the types of communication or motivated lying that tend to increase the odds of somebody becoming violent.
Right.
And so one of the things that you mentioned, and I just want to kind of draw this out from you if I can, is dehumanizing somebody, or taking groups that are already marginalized or vulnerable, like transgender children, for heaven's sake, and immigrants who are often in desperate circumstances arriving at this country. So could you say a little bit more about what you want to inoculate against in terms of the type of language or the strategy that's being used to make people feel really fearful or endangered in their group?
Yeah. Well, if you're inoculating against content, then the inoculation messages would feature counter arguments that undermine things like the Great Replacement theory when we're talking about immigrants, things that undermine the lies related to the dangers associated with transgendered individuals. That again, they're easy to demonstrate. The problem is it's difficult for individuals who are motivated to avoid being exposed to them, to open them to the idea of listening to them. And you do that by telling them they are susceptible to persuasion by other kinds of messages. That motivates people to do that. So in terms of inoculating against the dehumanizing kinds of messages that they encounter, it's important to reference the kinds of strategies that individuals use to get these ideas across. Once you're able to show your message target that others are trying to manipulate them by using these lies, they are more able to identify the lies when they're exposed to them.
Yeah. Yeah. It strikes me also that, I mean, since reading about, I mentioned you, I came to realize you were studying stochastic terror because I read an interview with you that somebody had done. And I've been thinking a lot about the language that I hear and the language I myself use sometimes with the people who make me angry, and or I just kind of like, oh, I mean, we've all been there, but it's made me realize how important it is to think about the language we all use about people who disagree with us, or people you can slide away from thinking of somebody as an opponent to thinking of them as an enemy, especially these days.
Right.
I'm so glad you're doing this work, because I think that we all could be educated about the danger of the content, and it's everywhere. It surrounds us.
It's important to know too, to bring up a good point. Like I focus on the far right and stochastic terrorism on the far right because that's where the majority of it happens.
Yeah.
But everybody engages in this kinds of messaging, whether deliberate or not. And I'm a naive optimist, but I don't believe that even a lot of individuals on the far right want to motivate violence. I think they maybe just see it as a useful rhetorical tactic with negative implications. Maybe I'm being naive, but I like to think that. But there are cases where individuals on the left have done it as well. When there goes Sully. When Chuck Schumer, for example, stood on the Supreme Court steps and said they'll reap a whirlwind.
Yeah.
That matches the definition.
Yeah.
So I think, if nothing else, this kind of research and just an understanding of stochastic terrorism more generally, it should do exactly what you're saying. It makes us think about the way that we cast those we see as opponents, and it makes us think about them as, human beings rather than a dehumanized group of individuals who need to be attacked.
Yes, and also in the United States right now that we're all Americans, and that should provide us with the fundamental commonality that we can all identify with, and then we can fine tune things we might genuinely disagree about, how problems in our culture should be handled. So I just think that I'm just really pleased that you're paying attention both to the content, the language, and also the strategies, because I think we need to understand both in order to be a much better informed citizen, and certainly a better informed voter, because part of what, and I'm sure you have thoughts about this, Kurt, but I'll be curious to hear what they are. It seems to me part of it is voter education too, that helping people understand that part of what we need to hold our politicians and our leaders accountable for is, in fact, the language that they use. And I think understanding the phenomenon of stochastic terror makes it really important for all of us, not only to, of course, to look at our own language and our own cognitive processes, but also to look at the language of the people that we vote for.
I think so. I think I 100% agree. My hope is that individuals that at some point the American electorate will be a little less polarized and will be more motivated to hold our candidates to hold their feet to the fire, to use probably a bit of a stochastic term, but to hold them accountable when they use language that might result in violence against political opponents. If an individual that I was thinking of voting for example, used language that could be interpreted as a call to violence against civilians who I politically disagree with, I'd be disinclined to vote for that person, because that's not the kind of rhetoric I want in the American body politic. So hopefully this kind of work can lead to a greater understanding of these dynamics, so people can recognize that these words have consequences, and the consequences, I mean, sometimes it's blood, and I think people lose sight of that.
Well, I think that's why your work is so vital, Kurt. I'm so glad you're doing it, because
Thank you so much, Mary.
Well, you know, it's easy for us to think, well, I would never be violent. I would never want anybody to be violent. But with an understanding of the phenomenon of stochastic terrorism, we can make the connection. You know, Ian Forster said, only connect. It's the key to everything. So we can connect that there are people in the world who might hear our words and do something we might not have intended. And like you, I like to think that the vast majority of Americans don't really want to live in a violent culture, but that there are people out there who will hear our words and take them perhaps more literally or in a more inflammatory way than we intend them. And that once we become aware that that phenomenon exists, that's a real psychological and cultural reality that we live with, then it becomes incumbent upon all of us to take responsibility for doing what we can to try and alter things so that the thunder doesn't arrive in a form of violence. We're referring back to your initial analogy. So thank you. Gosh darn, thank you, Kurt.
Oh, you're welcome. In fact, if I could tell you, like, as a last comment, where this research is going right now,
absolutely.
It's going to sound like a plug, but it's not a plug. It's still a ways off. But the next book I'm working on is on this exactly, and as part of this, hopefully to emphasize exactly what you just said, to show the implications of these messages. The next book is going to include interviews with individuals who've engaged in terrorist acts on the back of some of this subtext, to actually hear from the horse's mouth how they interpreted them and why they interpreted them the way they did. I'm also doing a couple of experiments right now to see whether or not the kinds of messages that motivate violence, how people interpret them in terms of whether they affect people's perceptions of norms surrounding the use of violence and whether they have the power to engage in violence. So the idea is to make this connection, to say that, we kind of have this idea that subtext can motivate violence. Well, I want to collect data to show that it does. And even though it's not actionable legally, it should be actionable politically.
And I think that I love that you make that distinction, because there's all kinds of things that may be perfectly legal to do, but they also can be perfectly horrible and dangerous to do. And most of us would never do them, and we wouldn't want to elect somebody who would do them. And so it doesn't mean that because it's legal, it's the end of the story, or that it's the end of our responsibility. And your new book sounds fascinating, Kurt. I look forward to reading it.
Thanks, Mary.
It sounds like an important contribution to our culture, to our country, to our knowledge and our ability to try and do some reparative work. So let me just ask you, so how hopeful are you, Kurt? I mean, I think given the work that you do, you must be a hopeful person. But how hopeful are you that we will find in our lifetimes a peaceable way to resolve our differences and conduct our politics in a different way?
This is going to sound completely idealistic and again naive.
That's okay.
I've said this several times because I've answered this question, like how people have asked, how can you do this research and still think that there's a peaceable solution? Despite the intense polarization, despite increased rates of radicalization, especially among the far right, despite all of these problems we're facing, something that stands out that a lot of people forget is that the institutions have held barely, but they've held so far. Yeah. And as long as the institutions hold in the way they have, and the way they seem like they have the infrastructure to do so, I have faith that we can find a peaceable solution. Not only because I kind of have faith in the American people, all of them, right and left, more than anything, even though I don't think we've ever gotten it right. We are a nation that is completely guilty of so many historical crimes, both big and small, that they're completely uncountable. But the ideals as they're written, not the way they're implemented, but the way they've been written, I think they are a beautiful thing and worth pursuing. And I think as long as we keep our eyes on that prize, on the ideals of the United States as they're written, not as the way they've been implemented, then I think that we'll keep moving forward. We're in a rough spot right now. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. I do think it's going to get worse before it gets better. I think we're going to see upticks in violence. I think we're going to see probably large scale attacks, but I do think that the institutions will hold. And I think at the end of the day, I think the United States will move toward the ideals as they're written in the founding documents. Yeah. So I'm always very careful to say that as they've been written, because we have fallen very short of what the ideals are of the founding fathers, but we can try.
Well, thank you. That's inspiriting and inspiring. And I guess it makes me think that when your ultimate goal is a more perfect union, it's more perfect. It's not perfect. We will always be striving. We'll always be struggling. But the idea of a more perfect union is a very, very powerful idea, as you've been saying. And I think as long as we keep aiming for a more perfect union, of course, there's going to be pendulum swings, but hopefully we keep aiming at a more perfect union. It will become a little bit more perfect over time, as it has been, even when it swings back. So thank you for that.
I think so. I think if we look at the general trajectory of the United States, we've trended towards the better. Very slowly, we've taken steps back. But if you look at it as a data scientist like I am, the regression line is going up very, very slowly. There are often hiccups. But to invoke Matthew McConaughey, he said a couple of years ago when he won Best Picture, he said one of the things he needs every day when he wakes up is something to chase. And I think that more perfect union is something that as long as we keep our eyes on it to chase it, then we're going to keep that trajectory.
We'll give Matthew McConaughey the last word then, since that's a good quote. Kurt, thank you so much, both for your work and for taking time to come on the morning show to explain it to us. I cherish it. So
thanks,
keep going. That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, be well. Farewell. Thanks, Kurt.